Okay, why don't we get going? Again, this is Jim Wonderman, President and CEO of the Bay Area Council. I want to welcome all to our second Opportunity for All Summit, brought to you today by Aon and the Berkeley Lab Foundation. Really excited that you all could join us today as we discuss the role of gender equity in the economic recovery. I want to start out by thanking the incredible Leslie Alfaro from the Bay Area Council team, who's worked so hard to put this together. So thank you so much, Leslie, for your hard work. This is a really important discussion. I think we'd all agree this past year has been one for the history books. At the onset of the pandemic, some said that COVID-19 could be the great equalizer, but we've actually seen that hasn't really been the case. From infection rates to mortality rates, from access to vaccines, to the ability to work from home, as well as some of the topics we'll be speaking about today: race, ethnicity, gender, income, location, have all played roles in these outcomes. The fight for gender equity has been going on for many, many years, and there's been progress. Here at the Council, we've been focused on this. We've had a committee geared toward it for quite some time. And we've been working towards better representation through our partnership with Silicon Valley Leadership Group on the 25 by 25 initiative, which is a recent initiative, and we're very excited about that. We've been working on increased education about the many workplace barriers and support for equitable paid family leave policies. Our Economic Institute has released several reports on themes including paid family leave, family-friendly workplace policies, and best practices for gender equity in the workplace. We're really proud of the work that we've done. We know there's a lot of work ahead of us. We're here today to ensure that progress that has been made in the past few years is not lost. We need to continue to have frank discussions about what is necessary to ensure equitable opportunities for women, for people of color, and other marginalized communities. We have a great agenda ahead of us today, and I'm excited to kick it off with Greer Cowan, who's a research manager at our Economic Institute. Greer has worked on a number of different reports on varying topics, from mega regional impacts of a new Trans-Bay rail crossing to the impacts of remote work in the Bay Area and apprenticeships in the tech sector. She's an absolute champion for equity. And with that, let me introduce Greer Cowan.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jim. So I'll just wait a second for the slides to come up. Perfect. So to set up the two upcoming panels, I'm going to share a few trends and interesting data points that shed light on how the pandemic has impacted women in the workforce. You can go to the next slide. So over the last year plus of the pandemic, in almost every month, with a few exceptions, more women dropped out of the labor force than men. So this chart depicts the net change in the number of women and men in the US labor force over the course of the pandemic, with the bars representing the net change in the number of women in gold and the number of men in teal participating in the labor force each month, as compared to how many people were in the labor force in February of 2020, so pre-pandemic. And as a refresher, the labor force includes both those who are employed and those looking for work. So the labor force getting smaller means less people are employed, but it also means less people are actively on the hunt for jobs at that given time. And as of the most recent data release, you'll see all the numbers are listed for April 2021, and there are 2 million less women in the US workforce than at the start of the pandemic versus 1.6 million less men. And at certain stages of the pandemic, there were even deeper disparities between the number of women and the number of men who had left the workforce. So for example, in September, there were 1 million more women that had left the workforce So at that point, it was 2.6 million women versus 1.6 million men compared to pre-pandemic levels. And that trend reveals, that our country is not set up to support working women in times of crisis in the same way that it's set up to support working men in times of crisis. And so as of 2020, California in particular has a wide gap between the number of men and the number of women in the workforce. So this table depicts the difference in participation rate between women and men in all 50 states. And you'll see that California ranks 47th in terms of the difference between labor force participation among men and labor force participation among women. And this is based on 2020 annual average labor force participation. So over the course of the whole year, on average, labor force participation in 2020 among men was 13.9 percentage points higher than it was among women in California. But in addition to those stats on labor force participation, the unemployment rate among women in California also spiked during the pandemic. But the rate of unemployment among women differed by race and ethnicity in California. So white women experienced the lowest level of annual average unemployment in 2019 and continued to experience the lowest rate in 2020. While Black women had slightly higher rate of unemployment during 2020, and the unemployment rate among Latinx women increased a full percentage point more than it did for white women between 2019 and 2020. You can go to the next slide. But circling back to labor force participation, when you look at it by age group, it reveals a really interesting trend. So when you break the data out by age group, you find that in California, the difference in labor force participation between women and men is minimal among younger demographics, but it jumps to a double-digit percentage point difference among Californians in their late 20s and onward. So the average age of mothers when they have their first child in California is 28. Which falls right into the category where the big jump is seen here, where the difference goes from 2.1 percentage points among 20 to 24-year-olds to a 13.3 percentage point difference among 25 to 34-year-olds. You can go to the next slide. So a commonly cited driver of this gap in labor force participation by gender is the cost of childcare, which in many cases is prohibitively expensive and can make a parent sacrificing labor force participation a more realistic financial decision than paying for childcare in some cases. As of 2020, the cost for an infant the cost of care for an infant for 1 year in California is as much as 18% of median income for a married couple at a traditional child care center, and 12% at a family child care, which is a home-based child care option operated out of an individual's private home. And you'll see here they tend to be slightly more affordable. And if you have 2 children, as you'll see on the bottom left part of this graphic, the costs are as high as 30% of an average married couple's income at a childcare center, and 23% at a family childcare. You can go to the next slide. And again, with this same data point tracking childcare costs as a percentage of median household income for a married couple, California ranks fairly low stacked up against other states in the country. So it's 37th for this. You can go to the next slide. And COVID even further strained childcare resources. And one outcome of that strain was mothers dropping out of the labor force. And we see here that mothers, and in particular single mothers, dropped out of the labor force at a much more significant rate than fathers. So the dark purple line is single mothers who at the height of the pandemic had labor force participation fall more than 7%, compared to that top blue line, which represents fathers of a minor who lost just under 3% of labor force participation at the height of the pandemic. You can go to the next slide. And another trend that played out during the pandemic was a decline in the supply of family childcare, which, as I showed a few slides ago, tend to be the more affordable childcare options. And in California, the number of family childcare facilities decreased from 26,000 in 2019 to about 12,000 as of July 2020. You can go to the next slide. And California also has an underrepresentation of women in traditionally higher paying roles, such as STEM occupations, CEO roles, and manager level roles. So less than a third of STEM and CEO positions are held by women, and less than half of all managers in California are women. And this in turn perpetuates the gender wage gap, a gap that it's worth noting is far more significant for Black and Latinx women, as you can see in the graphic on the right. And these wage inequities in turn can then play a role in family decision-making around who takes on more unpaid home care tasks or leaves the labor force to meet family needs. You can go to the next slide. So, while it's important to even the playing field among those high wage jobs, low wage mothers also experience drastic pay inequities. And during the pandemic, many low-wage industries that were considered essential or frontline workers have pay gaps, specifically between mothers versus fathers who are employed in those frontline occupations. And in almost all of these occupations, over half of the mothers employed in the occupation are women of color. So if you look in the second column, it shows the percentage of mothers employed in occupation who are women of color. And even in industries dominated by women, such as childcare and home health aides, there's a significant wage gap between mothers and fathers. So among childcare workers, mothers make 70 cents on the dollar compared to fathers, which you can see in the far right-hand column of this chart. And among home health and personal aides, mothers make 85 cents on the dollar compared to fathers. You can go to the next slide. Research has also shown that more mothers than fathers experience career disruptions. So types of child and family care disruptions that the research examined range from reduced work hours, taking significant amount of time off, quitting a job entirely, and or turning down a promotion. And interestingly, quitting a job entirely is actually where the difference is most extreme between mothers and fathers. So there's a 17 percentage point difference between the share of mothers that reported quitting to care for a child or family member and the share of fathers that reported the same. You can go to the next slide. And while men's earnings pre-child and post-child change very little, research has found that in the US, as well as other peer nations, women tend to see a sharp decline in wages after having a child. In the US, you'll see in that chart in the top right corner, mothers' income declines as much as 40% by the time the first child is 2. And those who have investigated this trend call it the motherhood penalty. You can go to the next slide. So despite all of these barriers and inequities, there's actually a proven economic benefit of having women in the workforce. Economists often cite female labor force participation as the most significant change in the labor force in the past century. In the US, across the entire country, labor force among women nearly doubled from about 33% in 1950 to a peak of about 60% in the early 2000s. However, that growth in participation was not even across all metro areas in the US. And research has shown that in US metros that have higher female labor force participation, there's a correlation to real wage growth. And the wage growth is not just for women, but it's median wage growth across the board that increased. You can go to the next slide. And California has been a leader in the past in terms of supporting women in the workforce. It was the first state in the nation to pass paid family leave legislation. An analysis on that policy shows that it's increased California mothers' likelihood of being employed 9 to 12 months after childbirth, and has resulted in higher wages and higher number of work hours among women in the early years of their children's lives. So coming out of the pandemic, it's important for California to continue to lead the nation in supporting women in the workforce as a state and as employers within the state. And so the following two panels will serve as a conversation that can be a jumping off point for building more support for women in the workforce during this particular period of economic recovery and beyond that. So ending on that sort of more positive note, I'm excited to turn it over to Jillian Slyfield, who is the digital economy practice leader at Aon, who will be moderating our first panel. So Jillian, take it away.
Great, thanks you, Greer, and thanks for sharing the Economic Institute's Illuminating Data. Aon is proud to be sponsoring this Opportunity for All Summit 2.0 today, and I'm excited to be moderating our first panel, The Exodus of Women at Work and the Economic Impact. So first, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump right into the discussion. So our first panelist is Alexis Krikovich, and she is a senior partner with McKinsey & Company. She's also the co-lead of McKinsey's Bay Area office, a leader in McKinsey's banking practice, and oversees McKinsey's fintech efforts in North America. Her work centers on driving growth and productivity at scale, including customer experience redesign, product and service innovation, organizational agility, and change management. Alexis is also a co-founder and author of Women in the Workplace Report, the largest research study that exists on gender diversity in the workplace, and she is a frequent speaker on the topic. Alexis holds a BA with distinction in public policy and economics from Stanford University and an MBA from Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. She was an R.J. Miller Scholar there, and she lives in the Bay Area with her husband and 3 young daughters. Thank you, Alexis. We also have, Nicola Petrosky-Neto, who's the Vice President Macroeconomic Research for the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Nicola, prior to joining the Federal Reserve in 2014, Dr. Petrosky-Neto was on the faculty at Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business. He's also served as a national fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and as a visiting scholar at a number of academic institutions. Nicola's research focuses on the business cycle dynamics of labor markets and how they're impacted by the functioning of credit and product markets. He has published articles in leading academic journals and co-authored a graduate economic textbook with the MIT Press. Nicola received his PhD in economics from the University of Quebec, Montreal, and his BA in economics from HEC, Montreal. I know this is going to be an exciting conversation. So we'll kick it off with you, Alexis. The Women in the Workplace report has come out every year for the past 6 years. What stands out from the 2020 report?
Well, 2020 was such an interesting moment for so many reasons. And in fact, we really considered in 2020, should we even go forward with the research, because the pandemic was unfolding and the uncertainty around that for so many companies. But the real reason was because of exactly the data that was just being discussed, which was the concern that women and diverse talent lose out disproportionately in any market disconnect or downturn. And that's precisely what we found. In fact, the punchline for 2020 was 1 in 4 women, that's over 2 million women, were considering stepping back or stepping out of the workforce entirely in the moment of the pandemic, because the impact that was having on them, not only in the workplace, but in all the externalities around that, in terms of their household, their childcare, their elder care, the support network that they relied on to participate was unraveling around them. And that's a really profound finding, because never in the past, in the previous 5 years, had we ever seen that attrition was a reason that we weren't seeing more women advance. It was, in fact, they were getting stuck and they were not getting the opportunities to advance. It was not because they were leaving. And so in this moment, we suddenly had an entire generation, potentially a female talent, saying, I don't think I can do it. I don't think I can find a way to stay in. And if you look across the communities, there are actually 3 groups of women that were especially affected. The first was already being discussed, which is mothers, particularly mothers of young children, where that number was 1 in 3. And it was not being shared by fathers in terms of how they felt about what they could or could not do to participate. It was senior level women, so executive level women who disproportionately hold responsibilities both in their companies and in their households that look different than their male peers, and the burnout and exhaustion they were describing with those added responsibilities. And then for women of color who already faced structural headwinds and real systemic barriers to advancement in the workplace, and in the context of COVID, because of the pandemic, the way that was impacting them looked really unique. And especially for Black women, where the combination of the effects of the pandemic and the rise in the focus on racial justice and equity issues was landing disproportionately on them.
Those are really interesting findings. Nicola, earlier this year, you released a working paper looking at how parents were faring through the pandemic. Can you tell us about the findings and what that means for the economy overall?
Yes, of course. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this conversation. And if it's all right with you, I will share some slides which illustrate many of the points that we found in our research that were touched upon by Alexis' remarks. And the first to set the stage is I just want to remind where we were before the pandemic and the strength of a strong labor market to help the economy close certain gender gaps in labor market outcomes, where there are significant gaps in pay, but one gap in particular is just participation in the labor market. And this chart here, just as a visual, is a good visual where we've centered everything normalized. We've put everything point to a reference point right before the pandemic. And what this emphasizes is in blue, women were entering the labor market in greater numbers during the late expansion years between 2015 and 2019. And that's really one of the benefits of long expansions and strong labor markets. And that was rapidly undone as soon as the pandemic hit. There was women were working in occupations much more exposed to the COVID shock, and household responsibilities and care for others fell disproportionately, as was mentioned earlier and as mentioned by others, on mothers. And what we did in our work was to use the main source for looking at the labor market collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and try to see, okay, well, how can we understand the disparate outcomes across gender, particularly along the dimension of parental responsibilities? As we are all dealing with Zoom schooling, we had a kindergartner running through the house while having meetings. She's in person right now, otherwise she might be running in the background at this time. And what we found is very similar to the findings in Women in the Workplace report, is that this downturn is really marked by differences across mothers and fathers. So here we're zooming in on the pandemic period. And the solid black line is the relatively small compared to other groups decline in labor force participation for fathers. You see that the labor force participation decline for mothers was really dramatic. And for men and women without parents, which are in the dashed line, we didn't see much of a distinction throughout this pandemic. It's really a situation about the disparate responsibilities for childcare and care for others in today's world. And when schools failed to reopen at the end of the summer in September, we saw another decline in participation. We had seen hope for a return to the labor market of mothers during the summer, but that was quickly washed away when schools were unable to reopen in person or even in hybrid form. And these gender differences were amplified across the income distribution, across groups, different demographic groups, and minorities were hit much harder than other groups during this pandemic across many different aspects of well-being and economic well-being. And what you see here is the differences across women in different levels of household income. And the decline in participation for mothers living in households at the bottom of the income distribution. These are households with earning less than $50,000 a year, was close to 10% by October. And that's 5 times larger than for women living in households at the highest end of the income distribution, over $100,000, just showing the disparate burden that was falling on mothers across different areas of the US society. Now, what I'd like to do is just do a little pivot and going forward, and I think I want to echo what Alexis said with respect to, let's think about the concerns for future cohorts of mothers and parents coming into the labor market, and that has more to do with the fact that what are the structural reasons for lower participation in general for women in the US labor market. And here I want to add by making a comparison to some of our peer countries. And women in the US have been falling behind our neighbors to the north. Here's the difference between prime age participation between Canadian women and American women. The two countries were very similar throughout the 70s and early 80s with rising participation rates with women, but something changed around 1996 or 1997. The two countries diverged. Participation of women continued to rise throughout the late 90s and the 2000s, and until today, there's a relatively small gap between men and women in Canada, but there's been a continued decline in participation in the US. And what's perhaps particularly concerning going forward is that this decline in participation is prevalent amongst college-educated women, where there has been a decline in participation since the early 2000s. And one key difference between the two countries, other than greater access to universal childcare or subsidized childcare, are the very different parental leave policies and I want to emphasize job protection policies. During the 90s and early 2000s, Canada expanded across at the federal level and at the provincial level, the duration and the strength of the protections during parental leave. So that today there are job protections for over a year, and the protection is really a leave with continued benefits, and it maintains a strong attachment to the labor market. And that is something that has been found to be a very strong predictor of continued attachment to the labor force throughout an individual's career.
Great. So Alexis, why are these losses of women in the workforce so alarming?
Well, there are multiple reasons for it. So the first is simply, we haven't yet made the progress, as Nicola was suggesting, that we want to see, right? So if you take the overall pipeline of talent, we are inching our way towards parity between women and men at the outset, at the beginning of job entry into the professional workforce. We're at 48%. That's a good sign. It's not all the way, but it's very close. And for women of color, similarly, we're at 18%, which is getting closer to the representation of the educated workforce in the US. But if you translate that through to senior leadership, what you see is it's a slippery slope at every step along the way. And by the time you get to the C-suite and executive ranks across virtually every company, sector, and industry in the US, we're down to 1 in 5. 1 in 5 women's representation. And for women of color, that number is closer to 1 in 20, virtually not represented at all. So if we start seeing a big unwinding in this moment, when we've frankly had such hard-fought gains, the likelihood of how long it will take us to rebound is really profound to consider, and we will be taking ourselves back more than a decade. And it's important not only for the women themselves and their opportunity and the economic benefits, but we see in our own research that companies with greater diversity in leadership teams, in boards, consistently outperform those who do not. In fact, with gender diversity the outperformance rate 25%, greater likelihood of having top quartile EBITDA performance. So this is real bottom line impact. And for race, it's even bigger, that's 34%. And those numbers are growing. So that impact of diversity on business performance is only getting stronger and stronger each time we measure it. So it matters not only for the individual and for equity in society, it really matters for our economic productivity overall and for companies' performance and ability to thrive.
Nicola, the paper mentions that the loss of women was largely driven by working moms leaving the workforce. What do you think must happen in order to re-engage those same working parents?
Oh, thank you. Just as I answer this question, I want to reemphasize that previous point that the lost opportunities of all this talent throughout the country that is on the sidelines is really, we should be thinking about it, how this is limiting our potential growth and our potential to increase wealth across the country. And I think that's a really good point. And right now we have an opportunity to think about the institutions and the policies that will enable all members of society to engage in long-lasting and fulfilling and growing careers. And barriers to maintaining attachment to the workforce due to childcare responsibilities is one of the limiting factors. There have been studies in managerial compensation and in the labor market that find part of the differences in earnings in upper ends of management between men and women have to do with the interruption of careers at different points over the cycle. And the ability to smooth that out so that there's no interruption of careers for historically, mothers have been taking the responsibility of childcare would go most likely a long way to resolving those differences, but also changing norms in terms of parental responsibilities across men and women, which has to be part of the equation. In terms of just the more immediate question and the return to the workforce of the women who left during the pandemic, I think something also that's worth noting is that when we looked at differences in employment during the pandemic across men and women working full-time or part-time prior to the pandemic, what we saw is that women who are working full-time and mothers who were working full-time looked very similar to men in terms of employment loss and employment gains. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that yes, they remain employed in a similar rate as men, but they did take on, and we know from other studies, all of the childcare responsibilities. So they maintained 2 full-time jobs during this pandemic. The drop in participation is largely from mothers who are working part-time. So they're holding a part-time employment to maintain their attachment to the workforce while also juggling the responsibilities of childcare. And severing that tie to the labor market during the pandemic does present some risk in terms of, especially if it lasts a long time, returning to the labor market. And that's why we need a strong labor market as quickly as possible so that they can resume their prior career plans.
Alexis, one of the statistics that you shared in the report states that women in leadership are more likely to practice allyship. How do you think we can encourage more men to be active allies?
Yeah, allyship is such an important piece of the puzzle. And the reason we care about it so much is, first, anyone can do it, right? It doesn't require you to be of a certain class or experience or background to be part of it. You just have to activate your empowerment, your capacity to do so. And second, because we can see the proven results of having allyship in the workplace. If you take Black women who faced before COVID the most structural disadvantage in the workplace environment, who we saw both didn't receive promotions at the rates they deserved and should relative to their white female peers and male peers, but also didn't have the inclusiveness and support in the environment. What you see in the data quite clearly is that when they do not have allies, their experience is far, far worse than any other employee group in their job environment. When they do have allies, they start describing an experience that's 2-3 times better across multiple measures of support, access, opportunity, all of those aspects. So the good news story is that when we asked, nearly 2/3 of employees, more women than men, but 2/3 of employees say, I think of myself as an ally to women of color. That's a great thing. We passively want to be allies to each other and to those who need it most. when you ask the specific measures that are signals of allyship in action, do you listen to the stories of individuals about their experience as women of color? That number drops to 40%. Do you support advocacy for racial justice and standing up against injustice? That number drops to about 30%. Do you actively mentor or sponsor a woman of color? The most direct way you could show up, that number drops to only 10%. And so what we see very clearly in the data is we have this passive desire to be allies, but we have not actually built the muscle. We haven't trained people. We haven't really activated that in a way where we're getting the impact from it. So frankly, the simplest thing any individual can do is say, not just do I want to be an ally, do I think of myself as an ally? What's one tangible action I could take starting tomorrow to take my position of empowerment, of opportunity, and share some of that with someone else who has less access? That's a great place to start.
Nicola, now that schools are opening up again, do you anticipate that working parents will be able to return to the workforce?
So thankfully, schools are opening to a greater extent and throughout the state and throughout the country. And we are seeing this in the jobs numbers. We are seeing a slow return in the last few months of mothers into the labor force. And we would expect, especially as there's greater certainty that these openings will be permanent. Part of the concern with initial opening and tentative plans was, well, in 3 weeks from now or 1 or 2 months from now, if there's another resurgence of cases, will we need to bring our kids back into homes again? And the fact that we have more certainty over the course of the virus now gives us more hope that come the fall, there should be a return to pre-pandemic employment for most people who left the labor force, conditional on the economy continuing to grow as it has been.
Great. I'm going to ask the next question of both of you, but maybe Alexis, if I can start with you for the answer. How do we avoid losing the progress we've made when it comes to gender equality in the workplace, both in representation and in pay?
I think the biggest thing is we need to move forward into a model that is not the entire virtual experience we were all forced into, but is also not the past we were in before the pandemic. Because the number one thing women described pre-pandemic that would help them participate more fully in the workplace was greater flexibility. And we've been forced, not of our choosing, but into the largest experiment on virtual work that we ever could have imagined, right? But we need to make it a version that is sustainable and actually is built for the future, for the long term. So not snapping back to precisely the expectations of before in terms of travel, in terms of, in-person time, the hours of the day and how the work got done. We're really focusing on the productivity of outputs, not inputs. And baking in some amount of that flexibility is a huge piece of the puzzle. And just to connect that to Nicola's data from before, this piece about women and mothers in particular disproportionately held the outside of work, the household responsibilities pre-COVID. We called it the double shift. In COVID context, that became the double-double, right? This was an extra half-time job at least. Mothers described an extra 3 hours a day of responsibilities they were taking on as school principal, as, line cook and cleaner. We just can't have that and then expect they can show up in a workplace environment in precisely the same way. And so I think the single biggest thing in my mind is building forward that flexibility in a more permanent way that allows everyone to participate, and then providing the infrastructure and support behind it for women so they have the stability to stay in.
I'd like to echo that point on flexibility. So we did find that women who are working in occupations with flexible work schedules, meaning when occupations in which they were able to define their start and end times for their shifts, were much more likely to have kept their jobs during the pandemic than women who are working in occupations with very rigid work schedules. And that has to do, as we were just talking about, with the additional burden of having the 2 shifts. And so being able, however exhausting as it is, to stagger those 2 shifts in a 24-hour day. And that debt really highlighted the importance of flexibility, perhaps in a very difficult and stark way. Those were very trying times, but it tells us what workplaces need to do going forward to maintain women's attachment to the workforce and growth and career development. And the other one, I think I want to emphasize again, parental leave is very short as it is, and we all know the importance of maintaining a professional network, of maintaining a job if it's not promotion within the organization, and any interruption, especially interruptions that can be of a certain length of 6 months or longer, can be really detrimental to all of those dynamic career aspects of maintaining a job. And so we need to find arrangements that protect people during the first months, even the first year of parental responsibilities. And that's something that we have an opportunity to set in place now for future cohorts of parents coming into the labor market.
Great, thank you so much. I think as three parents, we've all kind of shared our own experiences. We have that to reflect on in this last year and learn from as well. And we're just about out of time. So I want to thank Alexis Krakovich from McKinsey & Company and Nicola Petrescu of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco for joining us on our panel today. It's been an incredibly informative discussion, and we've certainly got our work cut out for us. I'd like to ask our attendees to stay with us as we go into a short break before the second panel begins at 10:45. Thanks so much. We'll be back with you shortly.